The railroad chose my town. They chose our land. But they didn't choose us, the people standing on it. And when I refused to move, they sent a woman made of iron to burn it all down. What I didn't expect was to fall in love with the very instrument of my destruction. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The autumn of 1887 brought dust and doom to Millstone Creek in equal measure. Thomas Garrett stood on the porch of his family's homestead, watching the railroad surveyors party wind through the valley like snakes charting their inevitable course. 43 years old, weathered by decades of work on this unforgiving land, Thomas had built something from nothing. The homestead sprawled across 600 acres, 600 acres of blood, sweat, and stubborn refusal to let the frontier defeat him. Cattle grazed on pastures he'd claimed from brush and stone. A modest house stood where his father had built a cabin from timber cut by hand. A barn, a well, fences stretching to the horizon. Everything here was his. Everything here was home. The survey party worked with mechanical precision. They drove stakes into earth that had never been violated. They measured angles and distances with instruments that looked like tools of some future age. Their leader was a man named Colonel Bradford, expensive suit, expensive boots, the kind of man who wore authority like a cologne. He sat on his horse, surveying the valley with eyes that saw only capital and profit. Thomas knew what was coming, knew it the way a predator senses approaching danger in the wind. The northern Pacific was pushing westward, and Millstone Creek sat directly in their path. Every homesteader in the territory had received letters, official letters bearing the railroad seal. Offers to sell at fair market value. Warnings that staying would be inadvisable given the circumstances. Millstone Creek had 6 homesteads, 6 families who'd carved civilization from wilderness over 20 years. Thomas had watched Colonel Bradford's men approach each one, had watched the fear in neighbors' eyes as they signed documents, giving up generations of work for whatever pittance the railroad offered. But Thomas hadn't signed anything. The next morning, Colonel Bradford appeared at his door with papers and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was tall, expensive, the kind of man who'd never worked a day in his life, but understood leverage and pressure better than any rancher understood cattle. "Mr. Garrett," Bradford said, offering his gloved hand, "I trust you've received our correspondence." Thomas shook it. His hands were calloused. Bradford was soft as silk. "I've received it." "And your response?" "I'm not selling, Colonel." Bradford's smile never wavered. "I admire your attachment to place, Mr. Garrett. Truly. But attachment is luxury the West no longer permits. We're building something here. Something bigger than individual homesteads. The railroad will transform this territory. Towns will rise where there's now nothing but prairie. Commerce will flow where there's now only cattle." "I don't need the railroad to give me meaning," Thomas said. "I've got this land. That's enough." "Enough," Bradford laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Mr. Garrett, enough is what small men call contentment. We're offering you the chance to be part of something significant, to profit from progress rather than resist it." Thomas turned away, ended the conversation, but Bradford's words lingered like smoke from a cigarette. The railroad sent letters, more official than the first. Final notice of acquisition interest. Time-sensitive business opportunity. Consequences of noncompliance with railroad expansion protocols. Consequences. That was the word that kept Thomas awake at night. He discussed it with his wife, Sarah. 17 years married. 2 children now grown and moved to Denver. Sarah had wanted to leave months ago. Her sister lived in California. They had money saved. At her age, starting over didn't require her husband's stubborn attachment to dirt. "Sell it," she said one night, their voices low in the darkness of their bedroom. "Take the money. Let's find somewhere peaceful. Somewhere the railroad hasn't decided to transform." But Thomas couldn't. Not because the land was valuable, but because it was his. because giving it up meant admitting that individual didn't matter anymore. That men like Colonel Bradford could simply decide what happened to you, and you'd have to accept it. By November, the railroad had purchased all the surrounding land. Millstone Creek was now an island in a sea of tract and corporate property. The other 5 families had taken their money and left. Thomas and Sarah were alone with cattle and buildings and a future that grew darker with every passing week. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning. Thomas read it 3 times before showing it to Sarah. New acquisition specialist assigned. Ms. Victoria Cross will arrive via stage December 15th to facilitate final negotiations regarding Millstone Creek property. Please prepare documentation for transfer of title. Victoria Cross. A woman's name. The railroad had sent a woman to negotiate with him. It seemed absurd. A negotiating tactic, perhaps. Something designed to make him underestimate his opposition. Thomas had bought and sold cattle his entire life. He understood leverage. He understood that surprises were rarely about surprise and usually about manipulation. She arrived on schedule, stepping down from the stage like she was descending from some throne. Victoria Cross was tall, striking. She wore a tailored suit that must have cost more than Thomas made in a year. Dark hair pinned back with severe precision. Eyes like winter steel that seemed to catalog everything they saw and assign it a value. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Garrett," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm. "Colonel Bradford speaks highly of you. Called you admirably stubborn. I interpret that as eventually persuadable. You interpret wrong, Miss Cross." A smile flicked across her face like lightning. "So it's Miss Cross. And please, persuadability is a spectrum. Very few men I meet remain truly inflexible. I'm not most men. No, that much is evident." She looked around the homestead with eyes that saw not beauty or history, but structural condition and financial potential. "You've built something here. Impressive in its way. The kind of accomplishment that makes men believe they're important, that their choices matter." Thomas felt anger rising, controlled it. "My choices matter to me." "Of course they do." Victoria Cross set down her portfolio and walked toward the barn. Thomas followed. She examined everything with professional detachment. The quality of the timber, the state of the roof, the organization of the workspace. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Garrett. The railroad is coming through this valley. That's not negotiable. That's not even debatable. It's inevitable. The only negotiation is the speed and manner of your cooperation." "I'm not cooperating. I'm staying." "You're going to stay?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Alone? With your wife? As the railroad lays track through your fields? As the construction crews work the surrounding land? As the property becomes increasingly worthless and isolated?" "It's my home. It's an investment that you've made an emotional attachment to." Victoria Cross's voice was clinical, matter-of-fact. "That emotional attachment is clouding your judgment. Our offer remains generous. More than any comparable property in the region is worth. Take it, and you can start fresh somewhere the railroad hasn't marked for transformation." "I'm not selling." Victoria Cross was quiet for a moment, studied him. "Have you ever been hit by a moving train, Mr. Garrett?" The question was absurd. He said so. "I'm being literal, not metaphorical," she replied. "The thing about trains is they don't stop for sentiment. They don't recognize property rights or emotional attachment. They simply move forward, and anything in their path gets obliterated. I'm offering you the chance to step aside, to accept what's coming and profit from it rather than be crushed beneath it." "I'll take my chances." Victoria Cross gathered her portfolio. "Your funeral, Mr. Garrett. Literally, possibly. The railroad doesn't like being refused." She left the next morning, but her presence remained like a stain Thomas couldn't wash out. For the next 2 weeks, strange things began happening. Cattle went missing. The fence line was cut in 3 places. Once, Thomas found their well poisoned with salt. These weren't random acts of nature. Someone was making his life difficult. Sarah begged him to sell, to take Victoria Cross's offer, to get out before the situation escalated. Thomas refused. Pride, perhaps, or stubbornness, or the simple refusal to let bullies dictate his life. Then came the letter, official, bearing the railroad seal, dated December 31st, 1887. Final notice. You have until January 15th, 1888, to vacate Millstone Creek property, after which date the railroad will assume ownership by eminent domain. Failure to comply will result in forced removal and loss of compensation. 14 days. 2 weeks to decide whether he'd surrender the life he'd built or fight an enemy that seemed to control everything. Thomas made his choice. He went into town and hired lawyers. Expensive lawyers from Denver, men who dealt with railroad disputes. They told him his chances were minimal, that the railroad had bought judges, that property rights meant nothing when corporations decided they wanted your land. But they'd try. They'd fight. It was all Thomas had left. January 15th arrived with a blizzard that painted the world white and cold. Thomas and Sarah watched from the porch as riders approached through the snow. 15 of them, professional, armed, led by a man with a scarred face and the manner of someone accustomed to violence. Railroad men, Sarah whispered. Her hand found Thomas's, squeezed tight. The riders stopped 50 yards from the house. The leader dismounted and walked forward alone. Thomas recognized the move, psychology, not logic, making himself vulnerable to seem trustworthy, while the armed men behind him made clear what would happen if Thomas made a wrong move. Thomas Garrett, the scarred man asked. His voice was rough, sandpaper on wood. I'm Deputy Marshal Hadley. I'm here to enforce railroad acquisition of this property by order of territorial court. You've got 1 hour to remove personal belongings. Then this house and all structures on it become railroad property. Thomas held up the legal paperwork. I've got a restraining order, filed through Denver. Says the railroad can't touch this property until the dispute is settled. Hadley took the papers, examined them, tore them to pieces, and let them fall to the snow. That's the new court order. Signed this morning. Overrides everything. You've got 1 hour. Behind Hadley, the armed men shifted, positioned themselves to prevent escape. This wasn't negotiation. This was execution. Sarah screamed when the fire started. They set the barn first. Systematically, deliberately. Thomas watched 30 years of work burn in an afternoon. The cattle released to scatter into the blizzard. The equipment piled in the snow and destroyed. The house itself left standing for the moment. That would be the final humiliation. By the time the sun began to set, everything was gone. Every structure reduced to ash or rubble. Every animal dead or fled. Everything that made Millstone Creek a home obliterated in 4 hours of methodical destruction. Thomas stood in the snow watching his life burn. Sarah had collapsed into the cabin, unable to process the enormity of the loss. The railroad men worked with mechanical efficiency, professional destruction. They'd done this before. Would do it again. Deputy Marshal Hadley approached Thomas as the sun descended red and violent toward the horizon. Hour's up. You're trespassing on railroad property now. We'll give you until tomorrow morning to be gone. After that, we'll remove you ourselves. The house, Thomas started, stays. Railroad property now. You can take personal items. Nothing else. Thomas watched his home burning. The barn, the corrals, everything reduced to nothing. He'd built this over decades. The railroad had destroyed it in an afternoon. In his pocket, he carried the deed to 600 acres. Paper now. Just paper. The actual land meant nothing when power said it meant nothing. That night, Thomas and Sarah gathered what they could carry. Clothes, letters, a few photographs. They loaded a wagon Sarah's brother had left them years ago. Sat in the freezing cold watching smoke rise from the ashes of their life. I'm sorry, Thomas said to Sarah. His voice was hollow, empty, broken. Sarah didn't answer, couldn't answer. She was staring at the house where she'd lived for 20 years, where her children had been born, where she'd imagined growing old. The cabin door opened. Deputy Marshal Hadley stepped out. "I've got orders." Victoria Cross herself sent word. "You ought to stay put tonight. Tomorrow morning, wagons come to take you to the train station. You'll leave territorial lands by sunset. Violate that order, we shoot." "Clear." Thomas nodded. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. But that night, as Thomas lay in the cold darkness with Sarah sleeping fitfully beside him, something changed in him. Something broke. Or perhaps something awakened. The part of himself that refused to accept what had been done, that refused to let Victoria Cross and the railroad win. By morning, he'd made a decision that would change everything. The railroad camp was established 2 miles north of Millstone Creek. Hundreds of workers, supplies, equipment, the machinery of expansion laid bare. Thomas approached on foot, carrying nothing, looking like a broken man. That's what they saw when Deputy Marshal Hadley stopped him at the perimeter. A defeated homesteader, hollow-eyed, shuffling, someone whose will had been completely crushed. "This is restricted territory," Hadley said, but he didn't block Thomas's path. Broken men weren't threats. Thomas walked through the camp, observed everything, the layout of supplies, the location of the explosives, stored in a tent marked with careful precision, the schedule of the night watch, the water supply, the feed for the animals. He walked like a ghost, and the railroad man ignored him. He found her in a tent bearing the railroad's corporate insignia. Victoria Cross was reviewing blueprints, illuminated by lamplight. She looked up when Thomas entered without announcing himself. "Mr. Garrett, I assumed you'd be halfway to Denver by now." "I came to tell you something," Thomas said. His voice was quiet, controlled. "You can take my land. You can burn my buildings. You can drive me from territory I've lived in for 20 years. But I'll never accept it, and neither will the people you've broken." Victoria Cross set down her pen. "Threats are counterproductive at this stage, Mr. Garrett." "It's not a threat. It's a fact." Thomas turned to leave, paused at the tent entrance. Progress always looks right until it destroys everything that mattered. You should remember that. He left before she could respond. That night, Thomas snuck back to the railroad camp, used knowledge gained from 30 years of working the land. Knowledge that railroad men with their tools and their instruments didn't possess. He knew which tent held the explosives, how to approach it without being seen, how to rig something that would look like an accident. He didn't do it, not then, but he collected what he needed, scattered them in the darkness around the camp like seeds waiting to germinate. The railroad increased security the next day. Victoria Cross had become nervous. That was good. Nervousness was where mistakes began. Thomas watched from a distance as the construction began in earnest. Crews laying track, progress advancing like an invading army. The railroad was moving fast now, like they suspected something, but couldn't quite put their finger on what. It took 3 weeks to set everything in place. 3 weeks of careful observation and planning. 3 weeks of Sarah asking him what he was doing and Thomas unable to answer because the words wouldn't come. Then, on the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, the railroad camp exploded. The explosives went off in sequence. Tent, equipment depot, supply storage, water system, fuel. Thomas had positioned each charge with mathematical precision. The destruction was total, catastrophic. Dozens of men injured, 2 confirmed dead. The entire camp reduced to chaos and flames and the smell of burning. The railroad was set back 3 months, maybe more. Track construction halted, the project delayed, the momentum broken, and Thomas Garrett was arrested before dawn. They found him trying to leave the territory. Deputy Marshal Hadley already had a warrant signed by judges the railroad owned. The evidence was circumstantial, but it didn't matter. The railroad had decided he was guilty. Victoria Cross came to the jail where they were holding him, sat across the bars, and regarded him with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity. It was impossible to tell. "That was remarkable, Mr. Garrett," she said quietly. "Professional. Calculated. I'd almost think you had experience with explosives." "I build dynamite charges to clear stumps," Thomas replied. "Same principle." You've also ensured they execute you for attempted murder and sabotage. 2 men died in your explosion. Men with families. Men who were simply doing their jobs. I didn't. I know you didn't intend to kill anyone, Victoria Cross interrupted. But intent is irrelevant in territories where the railroad controls the law. You've won a temporary victory, and the price is going to be your life. She stood to leave. Paused. Your wife wants to know if there's anything you need. Thomas thought about Sarah. Thought about her waiting somewhere, broken again. Tell her to go to Denver. Tell her to be happy. Tell her I'm sorry I was stubborn. Victoria Cross nodded and left. But her expression was strange. Almost pained. Like watching someone die who deserved better. The trial lasted 2 days. The verdict was never in doubt. Thomas Garrett was found guilty of sabotage, attempted murder, and destruction of railroad property. Sentence, death by hanging. Execution set for March 15th. 3 weeks away. 3 weeks for Thomas to come to terms with what his stubbornness had cost. Sarah visited him the night before execution. She brought letters from neighbors, from people whose lives he'd touched. They thanked him for fighting, for refusing to surrender to the railroad without resistance. They told him he was a hero, a martyr to a cause. But none of it mattered. Tomorrow morning, he'd be dead, and the railroad would continue building, because that's what the railroad did. It consumed everything in its path and called it progress. Victoria Cross came to visit him the morning of the execution. This doesn't have to happen, she said through the bars. She looked different, tired, like the comfortable certainty she'd worn had cracked. It's already decided. I can have you released. I have that authority. 1 word to the territorial governor, and you walk free. New identity, new territory, new life. Thomas studied her. Why would you do that? Because, she stopped, collected herself. Because you were right about something. I've destroyed lives in the name of progress. I've burned homes and broken families, and called it necessary economic development. And somewhere in the middle of destroying yours, I realized something was rotting inside me. Something I'd lost so completely I didn't know it was missing until watching you refuse to surrender it. That's not enough to save my life, Thomas said quietly. No, but it's enough to make me understand that there's another way. That progress doesn't have to mean destruction. That we could have worked out a compromise. That I could have fought for you instead of against you. Thomas felt something unexpected rise in his chest. Not anger, not hope. Just profound sadness at a waste so complete it seemed impossible to quantify. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm resigning from the railroad. Going to Denver. Going to try to find the person I was before I became someone who destroys things. And I'm going to make sure your wife is taken care of. All of it. Land compensation. Living expenses. Everything the railroad should have offered you from the beginning. Victoria Cross turned to leave. Thomas called out, Victoria. Wait. She stopped. Don't waste what you've learned. Thomas said, the world has enough people who've forgotten how to be human. We don't need another. She nodded and disappeared down the corridor. At noon, they brought Thomas to the gallows. The crowd was large. Hundreds of people. Some came to jeer. Most came to witness. The machinery of justice grinding forward. The railroad's power demonstrated absolutely. Thomas climbed the steps steadily. He'd made peace with death. Not acceptance. Peace. The understanding that some things couldn't be changed, and the only dignity available was refusing to beg for mercy from those who'd already demonstrated they had none. The noose was placed. The hood. The platform beneath his feet. The marshal was raising his hand to signal the trap door when commotion erupted in the crowd. A rider approached on horseback, covered in dust and moving with desperate urgency. She was tall, striking. Her face was familiar. It took Thomas a moment to recognize her. Victoria Cross. Stop, she screamed. Stop. I have a reprieve. Signed by the territorial governor. She pushed through the crowd. The marshal hesitated. In the West, authority was complicated. The railroad had power, but territorial governors had power too, and both were real. Victoria Cross rode to the gallows and thrust a document at the marshal. Official seal. Governor's signature. Reprieve granted. The hood was removed. The noose loosened. Thomas Garrett stepped down from the gallows into a world that had somehow changed. 6 months later, Thomas Garrett walked among the ruins of the railroad's plans for Millstone Creek. The camp had been abandoned. The track work halted. Without Victoria Cross's direction, the railroad had lost momentum. Other projects demanded attention. Capital flowed elsewhere. Millstone Creek became what it had been before, just another valley in a vast territory that didn't care about the dramas of small men. Thomas had rebuilt. The house was smaller than before, the barn more modest, but it was his. And Sarah was there, and they had something more valuable than either of them could have imagined: time. Victoria Cross had kept her word. The land deed was reinstated. The railroad had been forced to pay compensation. The money was enough to rebuild comfortably, to invest for the future, to create something sustainable. But Thomas knew that victory was temporary. The railroad would come again eventually. It always did. Companies like that didn't accept defeat. They adapted. They planned. They found new approaches. One evening, watching the sunset paint the valley gold, Sarah asked him if he regretted his choices, if fighting the railroad had been worth the price, if his stubbornness had been justified. Thomas thought about Deputy Marshal Hadley, about the burning barn, about standing on the gallows, feeling the noose around his neck, about Victoria Cross walking away from her empire because something had broken inside her that she finally admitted was broken. "I don't know if it was worth it," Thomas said finally, "but I know I couldn't have done anything else and lived with myself. Some things matter more than being safe." Sarah squeezed his hand. Victoria wrote. She's starting a business. Something about buying land from homesteaders at fair prices instead of forcing them to sell. She wants investors. She asked if you'd consider it. Thomas laughed. Actually laughed. The thought of working with a woman who'd burned his barn, who'd represented the railroad's relentless appetite for consumption, who'd learned to care, who'd walked away from empire when empire demanded she stop being human. "Tell her yes," Thomas said. "Tell her I'll invest. Tell her maybe this time we build something that lasts." That night, Thomas slept better than he had in years. Not because everything was solved, not because the world had changed fundamentally, but because he understood finally that sometimes the price of being human in an inhuman system was worth paying. Sometimes the victory wasn't in winning the war. It was in surviving it with your conscience intact. The railroad continued building westward. Other towns made different choices. Some surrendered. Some fought and lost. A few fought and found, like Thomas, that victory meant more than just land. It meant claiming back the part of yourself that empire tried to erase. And somewhere in Denver, Victoria Cross was learning to be human again, learning to build things that didn't require burning other people's homes, learning that power wasn't worth anything if it meant losing yourself in the pursuit of it. The West was vast. There was room enough for both stories. The railroad's story of progress and expansion, and the homesteader's story of resistance and survival. Both true, both real, both important. In Millstone Creek, Thomas Garrett lived out his days on land he'd nearly lost to an empire's ambition. He watched his ranch prosper, watched Sarah grow old beside him, watched new neighbors move onto land that Victoria Cross helped them purchase fairly. He never forgot the fire, never forgot the fear, never forgot what it felt like to stare death in the face and choose dignity over surrender. Because that's what the Wild West taught men like him. That sometimes empires crumble, not because they're defeated militarily, but because the people they tried to crush refused to let the crushing complete them. And in that refusal, they became something stronger than any empire could ever be. They became human again. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.